cor meum duc pacem sentit, umbrae timoris evanescut, vocem tuam sequam semper, ad gloriam tuam procedo. Deus meus lumen vitae, verba tua animam pascut, per sapientiam tuam uno, fides mea confirmatur.
Welcome to another episode of Facts. I'm your host, Stephen Boyce. Today, we're going to answer the question about the Anglican Ordinariate. We've received numerous conversations and questions that have come in through your text messages, through your emails, or through different venues that you've sent through Facebook Messenger or Instagram. There's been a lot of you that have asked questions about A, what is Anglican Ordinariate? B, should Anglicans join the Anglican Ordinariate? And then there's even a third one. A lot of you ask if I'm going to join the Anglican Ordinariate. So what I want to do is not necessarily get into the big stuff that everybody wants to fight and argue over, and just focus primarily today on defining what the Anglican Ordinariate is, kind of the history behind it, because it's actually not that deep in history. It's fairly recent. And then I'm going to talk about whether or not Anglicans should or should not join it. I mean, I think that's a fair diagnosis that we can give toward it. And that'll kind of leave it up to you, if you're Anglican, to decide whether or not it's a good idea or a bad idea. And then on the other hand, if you're not Anglican, it may just be an educational idea for you to think about, like, well, what were Anglicans before, during, and after King Henry VIII? What are the Anglicans today, now that massive news has just come out, and looking at the first Archbishop of Canterbury being a female, the first female ever to hold office, creating the entirety of invalidity from top down. Where should Anglicans in England go? I mean, they don't have a lot of the same options that we do here in the U.S. You've got the Free Church of England, and it's got massive issues. You've got the Old Catholic Church. There's not many more of those left. So, I mean, when you start getting into these conversations as it relates to what part of the world you're in, it really dictates these questions more so in one location than it would in another. You might have to just ask deeper questions about your standing with the church, what church you're going to belong to, because you may not have the luxury. It's also an issue here in the United States. I've talked to numerous of you who are interested in Anglicanism, but you don't want to be a part of the Episcopal Church, and you don't want to be a part of the chaotic nonsense of the ACNA. You're looking for a good, solid Anglo-Catholic church. And as a result of that, you look on the map, you look on the demographic, you look for an APA or an ACC or an ACA church. You're looking for one of these continuum churches, and you can't find anything within 100 miles or longer in some cases. I talked to a guy not long ago, maybe a few weeks ago now. The closest continuum church to him was almost 200 miles. But there's a lot of other churches around. So that changes everything in your questions when you're asking yourself, where should I go when I don't align with this church and I don't align with that church? And then there may be another option you have not considered if you're interested in Anglicanism. And there's not a lot of Anglican Ordinariate churches either. But I know for a fact that there are some that work in a proximity that are different from other Anglican groups. For example, that same individual that I talked to the other day, there was an Ordinariate parish, oddly enough, within an hour. I mean, it was exactly an hour, but that's closer than 200 miles. So then it was a question of, am I willing to drive an hour every single Sunday? So these are things that have to be taken into consideration when we're examining the question of, should I ever join an Anglican Ordinariate? But before we ever even get to the full questions and answers for that, let's talk about what the Ordinariate is. So these are four questions I want to ask in this video. Number one, what is the Ordinariate? Number two, why was it created to begin with? And number three, what does it offer Anglicans that are not a part of it? And number four, what is the gains and losses? Like, what are we gaining? What are we losing? You know, that kind of question there. So let's take an honest look into the whole entire thing. Let's talk about it, what it would cost somebody, what it would be worth to somebody to cross the Tiber, as they say, to enter into the ordinariate. Now, its structure is not some sort of independent institution. It simply is this: it operates within the Roman Catholic Church. The technical term that has been given to it in English is it's called the personal ordinariate, meaning it's defined by people, not a territory. A lot of the dioceses are set based on proximities, locations. Like in South Carolina, the Roman Catholic Diocese is the Diocese of Charleston. If you go to North Carolina, there's a couple. There's one in Raleigh. There's one in Charlotte. So it just depends on where you are located. However, the ordinariate is not defined by a territory, but by its people. It was created in the year 2009 by Pope Benedict XVI. And one of the things that led to much of that discussion was really the 90s and the early 2000s. There's a lot of Anglo-Catholics who have been attempting for years through conversation and communication with the Vatican and different cardinals and even different popes, starting back with really JP2, trying to figure out what can be done for Anglicans to go back into communion with Rome without sacrificing the patrimony and the uniqueness that comes from the prayer book, the different elements of the English tradition. These are questions that were being asked long before the ordinariate was created by Pope Benedict XVI. This was going on really in the 90s and the early 2000s because a lot of the professing Anglicans, especially in England, were getting fed up with the Church of England even at that time. Liberalism had kicked in. This is where they started ordaining women to the priesthood and then even into the bishopric. This is where they started opening Pandora's box to a lot of liberal woke ideas that are now in full bloom today. This was an issue back then. I mean, this is what required. It was the Anglican tradition who started ordaining women that pressured the press to ask John Paul II, what are you going to do about women's orders in the Catholic Church? I mean, England over here is already ordaining them in theirs. And that's where he made the declaration and the teaching that women are not permitted to the priesthood in the Roman Catholic Church. And there's some debate about whether or not he was even speaking ex cathedra or whether or not he was speaking in category 1, 2, 3. You know, there's a whole lot of debate in Catholicism about when a pope speaks, to what level is it? Right. So there's good discussions about that. But there was a statement made by John Paul II that this was not going to happen in Rome. Now, what led to that? Well, it's the Anglicans going nuts in England and going liberal. So these conversations were happening back then where Anglicans became desperate to have some sort of reuniting with Rome for the first time, really since King Henry VIII split from the Roman communion. Now, there were attempts long before this. I mean, we see massive attempts to try to bring some sort of Catholicity to Anglicanism, whether you're talking about the Caroline Divines, whether you're talking about the Oxford movement. There's a lot of times where the Anglicans have looked at Rome and said, we need to have some sort of healthy dialogue and relationship with the mother church that we were birthed from under Augustine of Canterbury through Pope Gregory the Great in 601. So this has been going on for a long time. It wasn't until 2009 that Pope Benedict XVI, he's the one that created the avenue for this to happen. And it was designed for Anglicans, both clergy and lay people, to come into full communion with the Roman Church while keeping Anglican liturgy. Yes, the Roman Rite is involved. We'll get into kind of what that looks like, but the Anglican liturgy is still involved. You have similarities of the patrimony that are gone into it, like cultural heritage, practices, prayer book. These things are still involved. Designated prayer books. I need to be more succinct here. But they are used, and the Anglicans were allowed to maintain their patrimony, but go into full communion with Rome. Now, they do use kind of a special liturgy, the divine worship, the missal. Now, this is combining the Roman rite and the traditional English prayers together. It's kind of a hybrid that has come together to make this work, because remember, under Pope Leo XIII in the late 1800s, made an encyclical after doing a thorough investigation about Anglican orders, and he said that they were utterly null and void, looking at specifically the Edwardian orders, which not all Anglicans are under Edwardian orders anymore, and that leaves the door open for massive debate amongst scholars in both fields today. Is like, well, who is under the designated null and void concept and who's not? Because many of the continuum are not even under Edwardian orders anymore. They're under Old Catholic and Polish National Catholic orders. So they don't even apply into the encyclical that was given by Pope Leo XIII. But there is a necessity to have Roman rite to be in communion with the Pope, while being able to also maintain some sort of English tradition and patrimony. So they have their own parishes. The clergy are a lot of times married clergy, and they're allowed to go into, so let's just say you're a priest, you're in the ACNA or one of the continuum churches, and you decide you're going to go join the ordinariate. Now, into doing that, if you're already a priest, if the bishop, which in this case in the United States, it's Bishop Lopes, Steve Lopes, if he decides that you are qualified and capable of being a Anglican priest that goes into communion with Rome and then continue that priesthood as a Roman priest, you can be married with children and move forward into the priesthood and commune with Rome and continue your office of priesthood. In fact, I know married priests that have children who are part of the ordinariate. Father Josh Johnson is not far from us, about an hour north up toward Hendersonville, Flat Rock area. He's married, has a lot of children. So it opened that door for even priests to come in, having been married, maintain their marriages and ministries, and still serve the church Catholic, if you would. So in that sense, parishes, entire parishes can transfer. Parishioners can just leave and transfer, or clergy can come in and transfer. So imagine this, the ordinariate is basically Canterbury before King Henry VIII. You now have English tendencies in communion with the Pope. That's what it is. You have the beauty, the reverence, the poetry are all welcomed inside Rome's walls under Rome's rules. That's what the ordinariate represents here, that you can maintain the beauty of patrimony and all the history that was given from Anselm back to Augustine of Canterbury, all the beauty of the times when the English church was in full communion with the Pope, now restored and rebirthed into what's now the ordinariate. So let's kind of talk about how this happened. I mentioned that Pope Benedict XVI was a big part of this. But again, for decades, Anglo-Catholics wanted unity. I mean, folks, it's still a reality today. Even my friends in the ACNA, just last year, delegates were sent to Rome in communication with Cardinal Fernandez to have large discussions about what it would look like to have some sort of camaraderie and communion. Now, I had Stephen Alspech from the Catholic Brothers on. We did a discussion on that, and we talked about how it probably would never happen. And now, really, it definitely will never happen. Negotiations and conversations have completely ceased. The closest thing that's going to come to that would be with some in the continuum churches. In fact, Cardinal Fernandez also sent correspondence to the continuum, or really to G3, and there is dialogue going on there. Now, what becomes of it is, might just end in niceties. We don't know. Or it could end in some compromises. I mean, Pope Leo XIV is doing his best. to meet with other groups and have conversations about friendly delegations and conversations. And it seems like he's pulling for unity and peace. So maybe something could come of it. I mean, Pope Francis was doing that as well. We really don't know. But for decades, I mean, the Anglo-Catholics have longed for unity with Rome. Even today, a good Anglican wants a good relationship with Rome. Only the radical Protestant Anglicans, who are more evangelical and Pentecostal, think this is a bad idea. But that was not the case. That was not the heartbeat of many of the early Anglican traditions. That was definitely not the heartbeat of the early start of Rome. They may have differed from the Roman Catholic Church. They may have denounced certain practices of the Roman Catholic Church, but they did not believe that the Pope was completely evil and Rome was a bad church or anything like that. They just believed that they picked up bad habits. They started delegating things to other churches that were not really in their power to do. That was more of the argument, not should Rome continue as a church and is it not a true church of St. Peter? That was never a dispute at any point until recent times in Anglicanism. So again, issues with women's ordination, same-sex marriage, these things, Edwardian orders, these things have escalated conversations over about a 30-year period of time before Benedict XVI comes in and makes the provision. Now, Benedict XVI, he was very interested in Anglicans. I mean, he was very kind to them. He was almost intentionally looking for ways to get something going where they could come into communion with him and the church. This was definitely on his radar. And we have behind the scenes conversations that have been told. Now, again, we can't verify all of them, that numerous meetings happen with bishops from the Anglican tradition with Benedict XVI behind closed doors at dinners, talking about ways to create this kind of communion. And it ended up happening. Maybe not the way the Anglicans wanted it to, but it ended up happening nonetheless. And so basically Benedict XVI was putting this out there. Like, you don't have to lose your heritage to be in communion with the Catholic Church. I've built an ordinariate for you to do that with. I mean, that's basically how he responded to this crisis. So 3 ordinariates were birthed from this. The first one was in England, Walsingham, and that happened in the year 2011. So Our Lady of Walsingham is the first ever launched ordinariate, and it was right there in England. The second one was in the U.S. and Canada in the year 2012, and it is called the Chair of St. Peter. And I mean, what a convenient name for that, right? And then just right after that, Australia in 2012, you have Our Lady of the Southern Cross. So these are 3 ordinariates that were born right after all of the paperwork and the writing and the proclamations and the discussions and the editing. This is what ended up happening. We see in England, Our Lady of Walsingham. Then we have the St. Peter's Chair here in the U.S. and Canada, and then Lady of the Southern Cross in Australia. So what makes it distinct at the end of the day? So you say, all right, great. They made the obvious change here that you can be in the communion with the Pope, still maintain patrimony. Sounds great and all. But what is so distinct about it, right? So what is so distinct about the ordinariate as opposed to the Roman Catholic Church or even to other Anglican bodies? Here's the thing. The language. Here's where it's distinct from Rome. The traditional prayer book language is still maintained. For example, the Lord be with you and with thy spirit, right? In most Novus Ordo masses, there is a response in the Roman tradition to say, and with your spirit. Now, that's true, even in a lot of Anglican churches as well, when you're really at the beginning of your mass or even at the end, at various points. I've been in both. I've been in both with thy spirit, with your spirit. Honestly, it got confusing because there's even later traditions where it's not exactly the same either. The Lord be with you and with your spirit, or with thy spirit. This is a small deal, but it's a big deal to some people that like the traditional language of the traditional prayer books. So what sets it apart from Rome's tradition particularly is its language. It maintains a lot of that rich English, Elizabethan English at times. Thee, thine, thou, thy will be done, right? These things are important to those who are especially in the continuum. A lot of the Anglo-Catholics desire the preservation of the rich English patrimony in its language. And that is a part of the discussion. And the Church of Rome, when bringing in the Ordinariate, permitted this richness to continue. Also, the music. Music's a big deal for Anglican traditions. A lot of the hymns, Praise My Soul, the King of Heaven. I mean, these types of things are very important. Some of the greatest hymns were written by Anglican composers. I don't even know if anybody would disagree with that. I'm talking about in the English language. Even to this day, if you visit some of the Catholic parishes around here, if you were to go to, say, Our Lady of the Rosary in Greenville, or Prince of Peace, St. Mary's downtown, you go on a Sunday to a Novus Ordo Mass and you look at some of the hymns that are being sung. You look up the conductors and the composers of some of these 1800, 1700 hymns that are being sung. You're going to find a lot of them are Anglican, or were Anglican writers in the 18th, 19th centuries. And they maintain some of the most beautiful, sacramental language type of songs that were sung for many ages in England. And so a lot of the Anglican choral traditions are maintained, and they're used still in these ordinary churches, which, again, even though there's Catholic churches that use some of those, it's not really the standard either. It is the standard in the Ordinariate. The liturgy, it's still rich ceremonially. Most of these are more high church than even Novus Ordo masses going on in the U.S. Ad orientem is a big deal. Incense is a big deal. The way the choir is seated, you got to understand a lot of the choirs, if you were to go to even a high church mass in the Roman tradition, they're behind the congregation, usually high up. In a lot of cases, not every case, a lot of the choirs in some of the traditional Anglican churches are actually toward the front, facing this way. So you have the audience facing ad orientem with the priest at the altar. And then a lot of times you have choirs at the front facing one another. So some of that is maintained. Again, it really depends on the parish or even the building they were able to obtain. Sometimes it's not physically possible for them to do what they would like. But even things like the posturing that is used in a lot of Anglican traditions. Here's another silly one. I'm just going to throw this out. This is a silly one, but I actually think it's really cool. Most of the time, if there's a gospel reading in a Novus Ordo Mass, the gospel is processed to the left of the congregation. Whereas in a lot of the Anglo-Catholic and Anglo-influenced masses, you will see that the gospel book is processed to the congregation, in the middle of the congregation. I personally like that better. To this day, I like it. To this day, I think it's the better. It has the feel of the Old Testament. It has the feel of bringing the gospel to the people. I like it. Things like that are preserved in the liturgy and the ceremonies that happen. The reverence for scripture, I mean, again, they can continue to use a lot of the ancient books, prayer books, and even translations of the English language that came from Anglican traditions. They are maintained. The pastoral work is maintained. It's got a mix of really evangelical warmth, and let me preface that word evangelical. I do not mean it in the sense of modern day evangelicalism. I'm talking about the gospel and its welcoming and invite and sharing and teaching and emphasizing. I'm not talking about the movement, the evangelical. So I need to put a nice little caveat to that. But also it has the deep Catholic devotion. So it's very pastoral in its provision. It is pastoral in its work, where their goal is to reach communities and build churches, chant and plant more, which is good. It's a good thing. And I actually see, and knowing some of the priests in the ordinariate, they seem to have more zeal at expanding the churches by planting more than, say, a standard, diocese around here. And a lot of reason for that is they're new and there's not a lot of them yet. So there's room to grow and people want them. And they know there's a lot of Anglicans that are in distress, that if they were to put parishes closer, they would have easy access to people who are already knowing what they want and where they're heading and what they want to be a part of. So that's a good thing. So if you were to go to a Anglican Ordinariate, this is what you would expect. You would probably hear an evening song. An even song would come in and you could participate in the daily offices and things that you see in the prayer book. See processions coming down the aisle with incense, the priest facing ad orientem, a nice, wonderful homily that is given with rich, deep connection to history, modern time, and biblical principle, all inside a Catholic parish. That's what it would look like. So again, what are you looking at? What makes it distinct from Rome? Again, things like that, the beauty and the majesty of its practice, but also things, like I said, married clergy, parish culture that you see in a lot of Anglican traditions that crossed over, cooperation with other local Catholic dioceses and parishes. Even though they are Anglican Ordinariate, they are still in full communion with all the Catholic churches around them, whether it's Byzantine Rite, Roman Rite, and they could partake of Eucharist in a Roman Rite or Byzantine Rite, and vice versa. They can come to an Ordinariate Mass and they can participate. All of that is available to them, regardless, because they are in full communion together with their distinctions. It's actually a beautiful thing. I mean, you have the Eastern Byzantine Rite and the way they do in their unique way of liturgy. You have the Ordinariate, you have the Roman Rite, all of which are distinct in their respected practices, but they are one in faith. And by that, they can participate with one another freely, without any restrictions. It's a beautiful thing in that sense. So why do some Anglicans join? So let's kind of give a quick rundown into this. Like, why do some of the Anglicans join? Well, desire to be in full communion with the historic See of Peter, as I stated, has been a long, long time coming. So this is an easy choice for somebody who is just done protesting the See of Peter and Paul. Also, it's confidence that Rome preserves sacramental validity and doctrinal consistency. I mean, folks, let's be real here. One of the big issues, the massive elephant in the room for Anglicans, is women's orders. It's not a problem, at least it doesn't appear that it'll ever be a problem in the Roman Catholic Church. Oh, I know there's people outside the doors knocking on it and crying for it. They're going to have to do a lot of pretzels and backflips and manipulations of JP2 in order to make that happen. But things like that are a big, big factor. People are just tired of doctrinal drifts where Anglicanism has fallen apart on this time and time and time again. We've seen it in England. We've watched it in the Episcopal Church in America. We've seen it in New Zealand and in Australia fall hard on its face with very important issues. So with that, that would be another reason. Also, there's the attraction, the idea of unity while still having your heritage honored. Now, I'm going to put a caveat on there too, because The Anglican Church is absolutely fractured. And even after this announcement of the new Archbishop of Canterbury, it is even more fractured. So when you're talking about the Anglican Communion, you've got the ACNA, you've got a lot of like the APA, ACC. They will not allow their parishioners to take sacraments from the ACNA because they don't see the orders as valid, or they're in question, or they're practicing things improperly. And so they're not even communion in that sense. You can be in the Anglican communion and not be allowed to take communion with other Anglican bodies. It's extremely fractured, and it's getting more fractured by the day. Now, though Rome is one in doctrinal affirmation and on paper, I don't think it takes a genius to look at the circumstance of Rome and say that they have issues too. Can I point to the German bishops? Can I point to people that are making absolute fools of themselves in the United States, like Father James Martin and these liberals, as opposed to very conservative Catholics like Bishop Strickland? There are major differences from here to here in Roman Catholicism. It's not as clean cut as some would like us to believe, but it's also unified in doctrine while having these differences. So that would be something that brings them in. So then why would Anglicans hesitate to do this? You may ask, well, then, I mean, this sounds great. Maintain patrimony, restore historic relationships that were broke 500 years ago, go back to the patrimony before the schism. Why wouldn't anybody want to do this? Well, there are hesitations, and they're not invalid from that matter. Like these concerns are valid concerns, one of which is people are afraid of losing their Anglican identity. Are we still Anglican if I'm under Roman authority? Fair question. Another question that needs to be followed up with that is, what were Anglicans, Church of England? Again, the term was Anglos and things like that. The term Anglican is more of an established term after the schism between the fallout with King Henry VIII and the church at Rome. But Anglican in the sense of from England, the church in Canterbury was in communion with Rome from 601 to the 16th century. So were they Anglican in the sense of, did they have English identities, English tendencies? So did they lose things or gain things after they broke with Rome? These are questions that would need to be followed up. There are concerns. So you would have to ask yourself those kinds of questions. Like, do I see myself as a true Anglican? And what is that? Is that post King Henry VIII, pre King Henry VIII? See, a lot of people would say that a true Anglican is what they were in 601 and what they were in the year 1000, in the year 1200, in the year 1400. They would say that is a true Anglican. Full communion with Rome, with its unique patrimony that goes back to the practices that were going on in England for many, many years. But the fear of losing that identity is a reason somebody would hesitate. Also, some of the doctrines that are in Rome, like papal infallibility, Vatican I, this is a big reason a lot of the Anglo-Catholics do not go into communion with the Church of Rome. This is the biggest reason we have the Polish National Catholics and the Old Catholics, because of Vatican I, papal infallibility. So there may be some hesitation on papal infallibility. Marian dogmas. A lot of the Anglo-Catholics have no problem with the teaching in the sense of, was Mary a perpetual virgin? Was she bodily assumed? These kinds of questions. A lot of Anglicans have no problem venerating Mary. They would just hold it as pious opinion as opposed to a dogma. Things like purgatory. This is another interesting nuance, because a lot of Anglicans in the Anglo-Catholic world have a belief in some sort of purgatory, similar to C.S. Lewis, who obviously believed in purgatory. So they have more of a Benedict XVI view, but they still believe in the necessity of some sort of purging that needs to take place. That most don't believe it to be like middle age, you go to a place kind of situation, more of a process that's outside of time. So, but it is a dogma, right? And because it's a dogma, can you accept it as a dogma? So these teachings may be something that creates hesitation in joining that communion. There's also worry that joining Rome may abandon reformational principles that you agree with, that you think need to be maintained, that the Reformation did as good. Because a lot of Anglicans are like somewhere in the middle. Like, okay, Luther was right about indulgences. And by the way, he was. Even the response to that at the Council of Trent made adjustments and changes because not everything Luther said was wrong. And so a lot of Anglicans have that. We need to maintain Protestant ideas. So some of those ideas, may be hard to get through and just release and say, I need to let go of that. Or do I want to let go of that? So those things might be important. Another question is cultural fit. Ordinariate parishes can typically be smaller, very, very high church. Now, that's not a good reason. They're small Catholic parishes. They're small Anglican parishes, but it may be a hesitation. If you're in a very nice facilities around a lot of really nice, well-done things, community groups outside of the mass, working with people, it might be harder to get integrated because of how new a lot of these churches are. They're just a few years old. So that might be a big part of it as well. So that leads us to the big question, right? Should Anglicans join the Ordinariate? Well, let me offer some thoughtful ideas rather than giving you an answer of what you should do, because I can't tell you what to do. My goal here is to just tell you what's happening, what's going on. Here's what it is. Here's what it isn't. Should you join it? Well, here's some questions. These are thought-provoking questions. That's the goal of these episodes, right? So here's some things to consider. For those that are convinced that Rome holds the fullness of faith and that you need to be in communion with the Pope, yes, you should join the Ordinariate. It's a beautiful bridge that keeps your heritage intact and your options open to fulfill that void in your heart, that communion with Rome is important and that it was in the Anglican tradition long before King Henry VIII. So if that is important to you, you should ask those kinds of questions and say, is it important to me? Do I believe? Is that something I can live with? Like, these types of questions have to be in your mind. And one of those has to be, do I think the fullness of the faith can be found in the Roman Church? And is it essential to be in communion with the Pope? And if so, then you would make that move. That would be a good move. By the way, let me just say this as well. There are not a lot of Ordinariate parishes. You can still be canonically ordained, or if you're not a priest, you can be confirmed under the Anglican provision that was given in a non-Ordinariate church, meaning you can go to a normal Roman Catholic church that follows the Roman rite, Novus Ordo, whatever. And if there's no Ordinariate, you can actually go through that priest and that bishop, and paperwork can be done where you can be canonically a part of the Ordinariate, but not able to practice it where you are and be a part of that Roman parish and serve and be, integrated, give, participate in all the sacraments. You could be a teacher. You could teach OCIA, a lot of things. You could be a part of a lot of things while still being in the Ordinariate without actually being in an Ordinariate parish. at least until one comes to your community. Then you could obviously move parishes at that point. But even if it's not possible, you need to know this, you can still be confirmed under the ordinariate provision that was given by Benedict XVI while maintaining a good community and good parishioner life in a Roman Rite church that follows Novus Ordo or even the traditional Latin Mass at the same time, because you don't have a church you can attend. So just know that that's possible. Also, for those who still wrestle with key doctrines like I talked about, purgatory, the Marian dogmas, these things are questions you have to ask. Can I live with it? Can I sign off on it? And if you can't, it's probably not best to make that move. If it's that big of a check in your spirit, it's probably not a good move. So let me emphasize a lot of things for those that may be asking questions of should I or shouldn't I. Discernment is important. Discernment requires study, prayer, investigation, counsel. This should not be a knee-jerk reaction. I've talked about that on this program about people changing traditions awfully quick. Don't do that. Don't do that. Prayer. Spend a lot of time in prayer. Spend a lot of time in Mass. Go to a Mass. Go to both. Go to a daily Mass at a Roman Catholic church or an ordinariate if there's one in your area. And just sit in the stillness of the Mass and pray. Do the daily office. Some of you pray the rosary, then pray the rosary. Even Anglicans pray rosaries, by the way. There is an Anglican rosary. And then some Anglicans pray the Roman Catholic rosary. So maybe do that. Do something that is going to move your spirit in a posture of surrender, willingness, and change, while also asking God to give you boldness and conviction about what to believe. And then whatever you sign into to believe, you're going in with full faith and conviction. So the ordinariate, it's not about rejecting your past. It's not about rejecting something that you love. It's about bringing the best of really both worlds together. But you have to decide if that's true or if that's fantasy, because not everything's as clean cut. I mean, there are things that are problematic. There's people that have gone to the ordinariate that love it. There's people that have gone to the ordinariate that don't, and they regret it. And they either went back to Anglicanism or they moved into a Roman Rite or traditional Latin Mass or something like that. I know one guy who went into the Byzantine Rite. He ended up liking Eastern practice better. Fine. There are pros and cons to all of this. So whatever your answer is, the Anglican Ordinariate is going to be an opportunity for people to at least discern. And hopefully now you know what it is. And hopefully you will be able to navigate decisions like this. So this episode is designed for you, if that's what you're thinking about, or you were just interested in, never had time to process, or maybe you're not interested in it at all, but you were interested in what it is and you were curious how it worked. So maybe this episode helped teach you a few things about that. Well, if this is your first time to Facts, thank you so much for joining this episode. Make sure you hit like and subscribe to this channel. We're a growing channel, just under 2 years old now under the name of Facts. And we're also looking to build this even further. There is a link in the description if you'd like to donate to our ministry one time or on a monthly basis, even a small amount like $10. It'll go a long way as we continue to try to build this towards a website, merchandise, things that you've asked for. We're in the process of doing that with the board of trustees. So please, if this is something you want to continue to support and be a part of, you can do that. You'll also receive newsletters throughout the year from me. You'll also have access to me, questions, things that you'd like to talk about. But folks, as always, thanks for tuning into this episode of Facts. Grace and peace to you. God bless.